My name is Diana Belkite, and I am the curator of textiles and clothing here at the North Carolina Museum of History. And I want to welcome you to Coffee with Curators, which is a recurring series where we invite you to grab a cup of coffee or other hot beverage of your choice and spend the next half hour or so learning from one of our Museum of History curators. And before I introduce today's speaker, I want to invite you to enter any questions that you may have during the presentation in the chat, and I'll keep track of them to ask at the end. And I'll also post some links related to educational programs that the museum offers that have tie-ins with the subject that Ayla will be talking about today. And so you'll see those in the chat as well. So our speaker today is Ayla Ayman, our curator of political and cultural history, and she'll be speaking to us about North Carolina's Islamic heritage. Ayla?
Thank you, Diana. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. As Diana said, my name is Ayla, and we're going to talk today about the history of Islam in North America, specifically in North Carolina. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then I would be really happy to engage with any thoughts that you have. So as Diana mentioned, please feel free to drop them in the chat. So I'm going to start with a brief history of Islam and what is today the modern United States of America, while also showing some of the ways that we as historians can find the presence of Muslims in historical records. Then I'll discuss some of the various ways that Islam came to North Carolina, as well as a few of the historical Muslims that helped make up the Ummah, or the community here. And I'd like to finish by showing you some of the Islamic objects that we have in the Museum of History's collection. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, I hope you all can see that. All right, technology here, trying to figure out how to click forward. There we go. So Islam has been a piece of the American religious fabric since the 1500s, when enslaved Muslims were forcibly brought to the Western Atlantic world as part of colonial expeditions. The first person we know by name is Mustafa Azamori, who was also called Estevanico, who was enslaved by the Spanish conquistador Andrés Cervantes de Carranza. Azamori became one of the first Africans to set foot on the North American continent, and over 8 years he explored modern Florida and the Gulf Coast, eventually traveling as far west as New Mexico. So you can see here a rough outline on your screen of Azamori's trek, which was replete with shipwreck and ambush and attacks by wildlife. Great adventure story. And this is a later artist rendering of what he might have looked like. There's no additional documentation from the time period about him, though there are folk traditions that tell us about his life. So Azamori, whose name suggests, was raised Muslim. He would have been forcibly converted to Catholicism before traveling, because at the time, the Spanish and Portuguese did not allow non-Catholics to travel to what we know today as North, Central, and South America and the Caribbean, because they feared religious corruption among indigenous peoples, who they wanted to claim for Catholicism. And they feared Islam. It was seen as a religion of conquest that challenged the Catholic faith, and they based all of these beliefs they had about Islam on interactions with the Ottoman Empire. So it is a very, very long and complex history between the European nation states and the Ottoman Empire, which lasted from 1299 to 1923. But to put it very, very briefly, there are long-standing political, social, cultural, and religious confrontations between these two spaces. So as you can see on the map on the screen, the Ottoman Empire actually extends far into what we consider today Eastern Europe. So countries like Romania, Hungary, Serbia, and Greece, as well as across the top of the African continent. And right around the time of all this European colonial expansion in the late 1400s and early 1500s, the Ottoman Sultan Selim is in power. His portrait is the one on the screen. He expands this empire to its largest extent. He pushes deep into Europe, and he continues to control the Christian holy places, including Jerusalem. In addition, the physical location of the Ottoman Empire is one of the reasons that people like Christopher Columbus and the colonial explorers set sail. They want to find a trade route to China and India where they don't have to go through the Ottoman Empire. hence sailing off into the Atlantic. And as many of you know, when Columbus lands in the Caribbean in 1492, he believes he has reached India, hence why he calls the native people Indians, and where we get that word today. But if you read his and his crew members' diaries, an example of which is on your screen now on the left, something else really interesting happens. They frame everything they see through the lens of Islam. So they try to speak to the indigenous peoples, the Taino, in Arabic. They call all of the temples that they see mosques, and they discuss people performing the Hajj, or a pilgrimage, whenever they go to spaces of religious significance. These European powers were very, very familiar with Islam, and they did everything in their power to quell its spread. So what you can also see on your screen is a 1513 Ottoman map of the coast of South America, showing the Ottoman interest in expanding into the Western Atlantic world as well. So it's kind of a race for colonialization at this point. Now, the American elite here were also aware of Islam and the presence of Muslims in America. Thomas Jefferson, who owned a copy of the Quran, which you can see on your screen, included Islam in many of his early writings and political treatises. An example was the proposed Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, where Jefferson quoted Locke when he wrote that, quote, "Neither pagan nor Mohammedan, that is Muslim, nor Jew ought to be excluded from the civil rights of the Commonwealth because of his religion." So unfortunately, this language is amended before ratification, and the final statute that we have today removed all references to non-Christian groups. But laws were also passed that acknowledged the presence of Islam in America, including the Moorish Sundry Act of 1790, which considers the legal status of a group of Moroccan Muslims living in South Carolina. There was even a debate at the 1788 Constitutional Convention that was devoted to the question of whether a Muslim person could become president or not, which sounds a little prescient given what happened in 2008 with the election of Barack Obama. Similar to the European counterparts, the majority of American citizens knew about Islam in relation to the Ottoman Empire and the Barbary powers. So these were the modern countries of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. Many of their interactions involved piracy and kidnapping, as the Barbary powers attempted to control the Western Mediterranean, and they captured merchant and naval vessels. You can only imagine, to put this in a modern parlance, that this is kind of a PR nightmare for Islam going on. Americans also routinely sent missionaries to the modern Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa in order to convert Muslims to Christianity. And in order to do this, they started printing Arabic language Bibles. So you can see the first page of Genesis here from an 1811 printing. Now, in the majority of these interactions with Islam, they were dealing with imagined Muslims elsewhere, a foreign population, and they were not considering the real presence of Islam on American soil. However, we can find the presence of Islam throughout the colonies and America in the historical records and the objects that Muslims left behind. For example, one man was a skilled blacksmith who was stationed at Fort Shirley in Pennsylvania during the French and Indian War. It took place between 1754 and 1763. And he left behind a small metal charm, which is on the left. On the charm, you can see the Arabic phrase meaning no God but Allah. It is part of one of the pillars of Islam called Shahada, or the profession of the faith. We can also find Muslims in trade records, as you can see in the receipt on the right, where the merchant is signing his name in Arabic. We also find them in military records. So Muslim names appear on muster rolls going back to the Revolutionary War, including names like Bafut Muhammad, Yusuf bin Ali, Joseph Saba, and Nathan Badin. There are also a handful of men with the last name Salem, which could be related to the Arabic salam, meaning peace. Muslims also fought in the Civil War, such as Union Captain Moses Osman, who is the highest ranking known Muslim in that conflict. But perhaps ironically, the greatest amount of information we have on Islam in early America is through the enslaved Muslim population. So large numbers of African Muslims were enslaved, and they represented roughly 10 to 15% of the enslaved population overall. Despite significant obstacles, enslaved Muslims used their faith and multilingual literacy to build community, resist enslavement, and pursue freedom. They left numerous written accounts of their experiences in America in the form of letters, diaries, verses, notes, and autobiographies, most of them in Arabic. And one of the spaces we find a lot of evidence of Muslim practitioners is in Christian churches, which were essentially the only public spaces of worship open to Black people, and for many, a forced activity. So on your screen, and I apologize for the quality of this picture, it was very dark when I took it. On your screen is a pew from the First African Church in Savannah, which is probably the oldest Black church in the United States. It was organized in 1773. On the side of the pew in Western African Arabic script, someone inscribed part of the Surah An-Nas, which is the 114th chapter of the Quran. This final chapter was meant as protection, in this case symbolically used by the enslaved against their enslavers. This section from the middle of the surah says, Al-Nas Ilahi al-Nas, so humanity, the God of humanity. It's possible that other pews which have since been replaced would have had the rest of the surah written on them. We also have documents written in this same Western African script that are a window into the world of enslaved African Muslims. The vast majority of white people could not read these documents, and even those who had studied Arabic often could not read this form of regional Arabic, which uses different letter forms, as well as incorporating local languages written in Arabic script, which is called Ajami. This has led researchers over the centuries to assume that the writers were unlearned or that they had forgotten their grammar, and they often called the text illegible. In practice, this meant that the enslaved writers had some freedom in what they wrote and expressed. They wrote letters requesting to return to their home spaces in Africa, as you can see in the letter on the right, and they maintained their Islamic faith despite forced conversions to Christianity. Writing itself in this time period is also a form of resistance. So in antebellum America, including in the North Carolina slave codes of 1831, it was illegal for enslaved persons to learn to read and to write, and they could be heavily punished for this offense. And of these Muslim writers, no one left behind more documents than Omar ibn Said, who was enslaved here in North Carolina. So Omar ibn Said, who was born in Fouta Toro, which is modern Senegal, around 1770, was a religious scholar. He was captured and forced into the slave trade, surviving the Middle Passage and arriving in Charleston, South Carolina around 1807, right before the ban of the international slave trade in 1808. Said called his first enslaver, quote, weak, small, evil man and an infidel. And he self-liberates and runs north about 220 miles on foot until arriving in Fayetteville, North Carolina. There, after being jailed for a few weeks as a runaway slave, he was purchased by James Owen, who was the brother of Governor John Owen. And Said lives out the rest of his life with the Owens, dying in 1863 before freedom came. He left behind a legacy of 15 Arabic documents that we know of. Many more have probably been lost or are yet to be discovered. And he tells us about his life in his own words. Now, he is most well known for an autobiography that he wrote in 1831, and it currently lives at the Library of Congress. It's the only known autobiography of an enslaved person in a native African language. It discusses his life in Western Africa, his faith, his kidnapping and surviving the Middle Passage, his saga in America, and he discusses the Owen family who enslaved him. Perhaps most tellingly, he opens his autobiography by quoting the Surah Al-Mulk, which you can see on your screen. This can be read as a commentary on his enslavement and as a challenge to it. The chapter asserts that the absolute power of dominion belongs with Allah alone, not man, thus subverting the social power of Said's enslaver. He also includes information about his family and home in his writings. So the first writing we have of Said's is an 1819 letter to John Owen, in which he asked to be returned to Africa. And this is on your screen. He says he wishes to be seen in our land called Africa, quote, fi makan al-baryo suma kabira. Now this last part has proven a bit tricky for scholars to decipher, but it means in a place of the river called KBA. We're unsure exactly where this place is that Said references, though there's been some exciting new research lately. What we know is that he identifies the space as a place to which he would like to return rather than being kept in captivity in America. His autobiography also discusses his family, his father, mother, and 14 siblings, as well as noting that his brother Muhammad was one of his religious teachers. Other documents discuss his mother. So at the bottom of both of these documents, he writes, I am Omar ibn Said. My mother is Yasnik. May Allah comfort her resting place. This phrasing suggests that his mother had passed away before he was brought to America. Said also writes numerous documents that combine Islam and Christianity. So on the left is a tan document that begins with the Basmala, which is a phrase that is recited before each verse of the Quran, except for the 9th. And he continues by writing the 23rd Psalm. And then he ends it with the Quranic phrase, all good is from Allah and no other. He also blends religions in an 1853 letter on the right to John Taylor, who was a friend of the Owen family, where he combines the first verse of the Quran, Al-Fatiha, with Psalm 123, both of which provide commentary on Said's position as an enslaved, non-Christian man in a white Christian-dominant society. It is worth noting that neither the slavery of the Quran nor the slavery of the Bible, which both include provisions for kind treatment and manumission of the enslaved, align with the brutal race-based chattel slavery that Said experienced in the United States. And it is possible that he is attempting to better understand the social condition that he has been forced into by examining both of these texts. Another interesting facet of Said's life is that there are 3 known photographs of him where he's the sole subject. This is an astounding rarity for an enslaved person, who often appear only in positions of servitude to white individuals or are used as scientific curiosities when they are photographed. And as you can see in these images, Said is also presenting himself very directly to the viewer, almost as if challenging the camera. He's also wearing a head wrap in all of these images, in a similar fashion to how other known enslaved Muslims depicted themselves when sitting for portraits. So you can see on the left of your screen is Yara Mahmoud, who was a resident of Georgetown outside of DC. And on the right is Ayuba Suleiman Diallo of Maryland. Both men were emancipated during their lifetimes, and Diallo returned to Africa. But you can see a real similarity with their dress, especially between Mahmoud on the left and Said in their choice of cap and very thick coat. And while Said left behind significant and incredible documentation about his life, it is important that we not assume his experience is the only one, nor that he is representative of all enslaved or all enslaved Muslims. Many others remain unidentified, but their importance in bringing Islam to the United States should not be underestimated or discounted. That said, Said is also not the only known enslaved Muslim in North Carolina. A couple others entered the realm of folklore, including a man called Sequash of Mecklenburg and Lincoln counties. He was a man of Arabic learning who was reportedly given enormous privilege on the plantation where he was enslaved. Another man of history and myth is Osman, who self-liberated from Albemarle Sound and lived as a maroon in the Great Dismal Swamp. He was said to have the, quote, power of speech with snakes and animals of the forest and the swamps, as well as leading a reign of terror against known area planters. So this is an image of Osman drawn by David Strother in 1856, and it's the only known image of a man that has otherwise been lost to history. But numerous other names from North Carolina records that hint at Muslim practice include Old Hamidi from Loch Adel, Hamid from Buncombe, Mariam and Abid from Guilford, Bina from Airedale, Minta from Person, Tamar and Rockingham, and Solomon and Stanley. Though we do not have any further information about them at this time, but we know that they were spread throughout the state. This lack of information is especially true of enslaved Muslim women, who tend to be doubly erased from the historical record, given their status as enslaved as well as their sex. But we know that women, in addition to birthing the next generation of Muslims, were also tasked with carrying on foodways and other cultural traditions. And we can still trace their presence today through these traditions. So one example is what are known as saraka cakes. These are rice cakes prepared for special occasions, such as Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha, and are connected to the Arabic word sadaqah, which means free will offering. So they're part of one of the other pillars of Islam, zakat, or almsgiving. And Katie Brown, who you can see on your screen, is the descendant of known enslaved Muslim Bilali Muhammad. She remembered her grandmother making these cakes, saying in part, quote, "She makes funny flat cakes she calls saraka. She make them the same day every year, and it's a big day. She washes the rice, pours off all the water. She take that rice and put it in a wooden mortar and beat it to paste with a wooden pestle. She add honey, sometimes sugar, and make it into a flat cake with her hands. Saraka, she calls them." So you can still find very similar cakes throughout the Carolinas, Georgia, and down into New Orleans. Now, in addition to enslaved Muslims, there were other Muslim practitioners in North Carolina as early as the 16th century, when Muslim soldiers from North Africa and the Ottoman Empire, who were captured in all these European wars, were deposited in coastal cities throughout the South as punishment, including in Wilmington. Trade with North Africa, including importing Algerian horses and their riders during the Revolutionary War, and importing camels and their handlers to form a United States Camel Corps during the Civil War, also created spaces of immigration and political alliance. And you can see a picture of an untrained camel rider attempting to mount a camel on the left of your screen. So the 1870s also saw larger immigrations from Ottoman provinces, such as modern Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel. And you can see the image on the right shows a young Lebanese couple in North Carolina. This influx of Muslims, along with an Orientalist fascination with Islam, left an impact on major literary movements as well as food, music, and linguistic traditions. Today, there's a thriving community of over 28,000 individuals in North Carolina, and there are almost 100 masjids or mosques, community centers, and student associations throughout the state. And you can see here a map made by a colleague of mine, Al Rader, who I believe is here with us today, showing all of their locations from coast to mountains. All of these people bring Islam not just from sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, but from around the globe. And some have been practicing in the United States for generations. Each have their own unique traditions that have blended to create a uniquely American Islamic practice and community. So here at the Museum of History, there's a small collection of faith objects that represent these communities, including prayer rugs in the middle called sajada, prayer beads on the left called tasbih or misbaha, a Quran stand called a rihal, which is on the bottom right, and religious veils worn by many Muslim women called hijab, which is in the top right. These objects represent some of the many diverse experiences of Muslims practicing their faith in North Carolina. And we at the museum are actively looking for more objects that will help us tell stories about the histories and legacies of Islam in our state. So if you'd like to learn more about enslaved Muslims and African American history in North Carolina, you can check out those few resources we have for you in the chat. And if you have any objects or stories you would like to share about practice in North Carolina, please reach out to me at this email address or phone number on the screen. Thank you so much for joining me for this quick chat today about the history of Islam in North Carolina. And I'd be happy to take your questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Ayla, and please enter any questions you have in the chat. And we've had several comments. Excellent presentation. This was great. Thank you. I had a few questions. How did you become interested in studying Omar ibn Said?
So my background, my training is in Islamic art and architecture. Those are what my degrees are in. And I was working in a museum that was looking at religious traditions among the enslaved. And there was just kind of this light bulb that went off. Oh, Islam was spread all the way throughout sub-Saharan Africa. So of course, there had to be enslaved Muslims, which means that Islam has been in the United States much, much longer than we've ever given it real credit for. And then it's one of those things, once you learn about it, you start seeing it absolutely everywhere. So a friend of mine forwarded me a piece of Arabic writing with the notation that it was from the 1790s in Virginia. And it just kind of spiraled down from there. I think Said's great to study just because there are so many pieces that he left behind, and to kind of use as a barometer against some of those other pieces that are out there.
What are some of the key challenges you face when studying the lives of enslaved Muslims?
Well, they definitely share some of the challenges just studying people who were enslaved, right? White society did not think that they were important enough to document beyond in chattel records. A lot of the objects that they used were used until they quite literally fell apart, or they're very fragile objects that, for example, degrade once they're in the earth. So there's not a lot of documentation. And some of the best ways we can do some of this documentation is through naming, but we also know that white enslavers would change the names of enslaved persons. So you may have someone whose natal name, whose birth name is Fatima, but their enslaver insists on calling them Jenny. So it's kind of an erasure. So finding enslaved people in general in these records can be very difficult, and then actually connecting them to Islamic practice is even more difficult. But you definitely have enough records where you do have Muslim names, where you have slave owners writing things in their diaries, like they keep doing this weird prayer thing. And then if you look at when they're writing, they do it, you see, oh, they're clearly performing salah or prayer, like 5 daily prayers. So there are all these hints through the historical records, but you just really have to be digging and looking for them.
A question from the chat. What is your goal with this research?
Sorry, Diana, that was a little too quiet. I couldn't hear you.
I'm sorry, what is your goal with this research?
In part, just to bring knowledge, right? I think, especially as someone who's grown up in the wake of 9/11, a lot of people have no real understanding or concept of what Islam is, or they have a very misguided concept of what it is. And they don't realize how important and fundamental religions other than Christianity were to creating this country that we live in today. And just bringing this community the light that it deserves and the role that it played in American history, to hopefully shed some light on the role that they play today as well, is like the big, the big pie in the sky overarching goal. I also think it's really fascinating. So Islam is in this weird space where for a long time, scholars did not consider it an African religion, a religion of the African continent. And I think that inserting both Arabic and Islam as a decidedly African religion kind of expands diaspora studies, expands African and African American studies, and really does a lot for connecting past and present in a way that it creates a gap if you don't have Islam and Muslims in there.
We've had several more questions come in. Let's see. How does your research connect to what we see in North Carolina today?
I'm assuming this question means vis-a-vis Islamic practice in North Carolina today. If I'm wrong, please correct me in the chat. So I think the easiest way to see a connection is there's, for example, a mosque in Fayetteville called the Masjid Omar ibn Said. So there are people who are connecting their ancestral practices back to those enslaved African Muslims who were forcibly brought to the United States. And you see these legacies of practice, right? And normally that's something that's really only done when you think of white families, right? You think of in New England, for example, you'll have people who can trace their family histories back to the 1500s or 1600s or very, very early in American history. But when you incorporate these religious beliefs and create this kind of kinship chain that goes all the way back to enslaved Persians, I think it's a really powerful way of reclaiming space in North Carolina, reclaiming religious space as well. And you see, Eid al-Fitr, you see all these practices, you see Muslim student associations, you obviously still see a lot of Islamophobia and hatred rising as well. So it just means that it's even more important to keep educating around the topic.
Are there some parts of the United States or prior to that, the 13 colonies, where you might have seen more enslaved Muslims than others?
In the 13 colonies?
Mm-hmm.
So when we think about the original 13 colonies, New York and Rhode Island, Connecticut are some of the biggest ports for trade and transport. So New York actually has or New Amsterdam, it was called at the time, has an extremely large enslaved population. And they've been doing work, for example, the African Burial Ground, which is in Manhattan. Many of the objects they found with the interred remains have what I think are very strong connections to Islam. So they would find beaded necklaces, but they would all have 99 beads, which is a very traditional number of beads to be included on the prayer beads, the Misbahar, the Tasbih. And they were often in blues and whites, which are colors that you very often and frequently see, especially throughout North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa for these beads. So it's possible that they were practicing Muslims and they wasn't just jewelry, which is the way it was initially categorized. So you see them there, and you see also with the Revolutionary War, which some of it was obviously fought here in the South, including Guilford Courthouse. But the Revolutionary War, a lot of the muster rolls is where we are pulling these Muslim names from. So we can see their presence in those spaces. And then the charm that I showed earlier, the small metal disc, was from Pennsylvania. So we're definitely seeing their presence throughout the initial 13 colonies. And then, as I mentioned, we have some of those Ottoman or Muslim sailors punished by being dropped off in coastal cities up and down the eastern seaboard, including in Wilmington, starting in the 16th century. So pretty early.
I think that's all the time we have for now, but I've put your contact information in the chat and you shared it earlier. So anyone who has additional questions can follow up with you directly. And I thank you all for coming out today.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'd be happy to connect with you.